Hello and welcome everyone to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. It's great to have you here. My name is Chris Sands and I work on Canada here, so I get a special little walk-on role. We have a tremendous event today and I don't want to take anything away from that, but I will just mention that we will start the conference with the keynotes, go through 2 panels, and then we'll have a reception at the end where we can continue our networking. So it's going to be a busy day. I'm going to get it started. And our first item on the agenda is to hear from Bishop Leah Daughtry, who is a national presiding prelate in the House of the Lord Churches and also vice chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Woodrow Wilson Center, to give us an invocation. Bishop.
Let us pray. Creator God, lover of peace, freedom, and justice, we gather today to remember and to work for those who cannot be here, for those who have been separated from us. We seek answers and solutions for the protection of our innocence. We ask your blessing for this sacred task, to advocate, to fight, and to work for those entrusted to our care as we seek to fulfill the authority and responsibilities of faithful citizenship. We ask your protection and comfort for all who are held hostage, physically, mentally, and emotionally. For those who are hostages to the senselessness of war, at the mercy of brazen and emboldened captors. For those who are separated from loved ones by the weaponry of war, who are hostages to the fruit of war, starving, homeless, sick, and dying. Forgive us the world over for the ways in which we dehumanize our brothers and sisters and discount the value of their breath. Forgive us the world over for seeing others as pawns and chess pieces in global power moves. We ask your intervention in the hearts and minds of those who act as captor, callously and carelessly dividing families and loved ones. We ask your intervention in the hearts and minds of those creating captivity, imposing or allowing starvation, sickness, displacement, and the death of innocents. We ask your intervention in the hearts and minds of those who have the power to speak for those whose voices have been silenced, and to act for those who cannot act for themselves. Help us to honor the humanity of all those caught in the senseless cycle of war and conflict. Help us to remember that they have names. Help us to remember that all of them, all of us, is made in your divine image. Help us to work for them, to speak for them, to act for them. Let their voice be our voice. Let our voice be their voice. Let us be their hope, their strength, and their light until all the families are whole, until all the families are well. Amen. Amen and amen.
Amen.
It's now my honor to introduce to you the President and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, former Congressman, former Ambassador, and former Administrator of USAID, the Honorable Mark Green.
Thank you, Chris and Bishop Daughtry. Your moving words remind us that while arbitrary detention is a diplomatic challenge, it's first and foremost a human catastrophe for those wrongly held and for the families who worry about them each and every day. So just a few days ago, I was traveling in eastern Ukraine. As we went around our 1,300-mile trip, we heard countless stories of how Putin's forces have seized citizens in a dark effort to bully Ukraine into submission. They've even snatched young children. As we traveled through places like Kyiv and Kherson, Odessa, Dnipro, Kharkiv, we heard story after story of the suffering that Vladimir Putin has caused. But we heard just as many expressions of deep gratitude for American support, and their simple request of us over and over again was to stay with them in their moment of greatest need. Events like today are a reminder that America will always stand with those who are victimized by tyrants and tyranny, whether it be Russia or China, whether it be in the Middle East or in Asia. I am proud that the Center is hosting this important gathering. You know, we're a unique institution in foreign policy. We're congressionally chartered, we're scholarship-driven, and we're fiercely nonpartisan and independent. And that special status creates special obligations to not duplicate what others are doing, but instead to prioritize the most important issues, and to do so in ways that add value and make a difference. It's why we have a Keynote Institute, the only American research program of its kind focusing on our neighbors to the north. And it's why we're here today, marking the 3rd anniversary of the Initiative Against Arbitrary Detention. Chris and his team have been tracking this important initiative ever since Canada first proposed it in 2021. We're grateful for the support of Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian Embassy, and the State Department's Office for Hostage Affairs in developing today's program, and we're grateful to our friends at CSIS for lending their considerable expertise. Arbitrary detention and hostage-taking by authoritarian states is an issue that's near and dear to our hearts here at the Center. Our Keynote Institute has repeatedly called for the release of innocents like Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, unfairly imprisoned by Russia over 320 days ago. But we go further, providing a refuge for former hostages through programs like our Threatened and Displaced Scholars Initiative. And joining us today are 2 Wilson Fellows who have experienced arbitrary detention firsthand. There's Dr. Holly Esfandiari, the founder of our Middle East program. She spent 105 days in solitary confinement in Tehran's Evin prison. And Saimak Namazi, who was finally released in September 2023 after 8 years of arbitrary imprisonment in Iran. Saimak is only here with us today because of the administration's tireless efforts, and in particular the efforts of 2 who are speaking today, Secretary Blinken and Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Roger Carstens. So now let's begin. Our first keynote speaker is the 71st Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He previously served as Deputy National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama, and during the first Obama administration, as National Security Advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden. His current role is the culmination of a long personal and professional relationship with Joe Biden that dates back to 2002, when Mr. Blinken served as a staff director for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What you may not know about Secretary Blinken is he's also a member of the board of the Wilson Center. And I note that many of our board members are here today, and we decided, given how busy the Secretary is, we thought we'd bring the board to him. Mr. Secretary, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very, very much. And the board meeting is now convened. Bishop, thank you for your powerful words and very appropriate words. I think you pointed to something that is perhaps most significant of all in the moment that we're all living and is the greatest poison in the human well, and that is dehumanization. The inability to see the humanity in each other. When that happens, when our hearts harden, then it's very, very difficult to move forward. And so I hope that both your words and the work that we're all doing together on this particular aspect of dehumanization, and that is arbitrary detention, will resonate. Mark, thank you for your leadership over so many years in so many different ways. It's particularly good to be here back at the Wilson Center. I've had opportunities to be here over the years on many occasions, but this is an institution that is doing consequential work on the most significant challenges of our time. We're grateful for it because, needless to say, there is no monopoly on ideas, never mind good ideas. And we certainly need them and welcome them. I'm very grateful to our co-hosts as well from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I have a little bit of history with that wonderful institution, having been a senior fellow there some years ago, and Global Affairs Canada, as well as the experts, the journalists, and other partners for civil society who are here with us today. Each of you is critical to ending this practice of wrongful detention. And I'd particularly like to recognize the formerly detained individuals and their families who are here today and that Mark's already referenced. Not only extraordinary advocates, but indispensable partners. And the fact that having been through an experience that's almost impossible for anyone who's not been through it to fully describe or appreciate, the fact that you continue to lend your time, your efforts, your passion, your hearts to helping to end this practice and to helping others means a lot. And last but not least, to my colleague and to my friend, Mélanie Joly, the Foreign Minister of Canada. Melanie's personal commitment to this issue, bringing arbitrarily detained people home, supporting their families, strengthening our international response. This builds on decades of Canadian leadership, and it's been instrumental in getting us to the place we're at today. And then finally, as we're doing thanks, Mark's mentioned this, but I have to give a special tip of the hat to my friend and colleague, Roger Carstens, our Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. Now, Roger's office is lined with photographs of unjustly held Americans. His team are constantly traveling the country, constantly traveling the world to visit with families, to try to find ways forward. And what I've seen over these past 3 years is a leader and a team that lead especially with extraordinary empathy and absolute determination so that we can look families in the eye and say, we are doing everything possible to bring your loved ones home. I carry with me and have in my office a card where I have the names of every arbitrarily detained American around the world. And of all the things that I get some pleasure from doing in this job, none gives me greater pleasure than crossing a name off of that list. Thanks to the work of Roger, his team, thanks to the very difficult decisions that President Biden has made over the course of the last 3 years, we have been able to cross out 45 names since 2021, including just in December when we brought home 6 American citizens, the last Americans wrongfully held in Venezuela. But there are still too many people on that list. And I know that homecomings are bittersweet things, even painful things for the families whose loved ones remain detained. I mean, on the one hand, it's a reminder that everything is possible and that, yes, we are going to bring their loved one home. But until that day happens, it's also painful. Yesterday, as it happens, I spoke on the phone with Paul Whelan. Our intensive efforts to bring Paul home continue every single day. And they will until he and Evan Gershkovich and every other American wrongfully detained is back with their loved ones. We're also working to bring home the remaining hostages in Gaza, who've now been held for more than 130 days. Working intensely with Egypt, with Qatar, on a proposal to bring about their release. I've also met with their families multiple times. They're being supported by our SPIHA team. The agony that they face, simply not knowing the fate of their loved ones, is beyond our imaginations. And here's the truly heartbreaking part. Unfortunately, this is part of a rising trend. Increasingly, states, but also non-state actors, are wrongfully detaining people, often as political pawns. This practice threatens the safety of everyone who travels, conducts business, who lives abroad. It's, of course, a brazen violation of individual human rights of the victims, a violation of international law, a violation of state sovereignty. And first and foremost, a violation of their basic humanity. Back in July of 2022, President Biden declared that hostage-taking and wrongful detention are a national emergency. That declaration, building on the bipartisan Robert Levinson Act, has expanded the toolkit that we can use to help get our people home, with sanctions, with visa restrictions, with greater coordination across our own government. Now, bringing people home is our primary focus, but it is not, in and of itself and alone, enough to resolve what is genuinely a crisis. The international community has to join together to deter future detentions so that we can actually put an end to this practice once and for all. And the most effective way to do that is through collective action. For all that any one of our individual countries can bring to the table, we can bring so much more, and this is at the heart of the Canadian initiative, when we're actually acting together. That's the spirit behind the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in state-to-state relations. Now 74 countries, plus the European Union, have signed on to this initiative, and we're proud to have endorsed the declaration back in January of 2021. This coalition is raising the financial and reputational costs of arbitrary detention and strengthening global pressure against it. We're synchronizing best practices for deterrence. We're building out a global network of hostage affairs envoys like Roger, and I'm happy to see that Canada's first senior official for hostage affairs, Joly Sunday, is also with us today. We're working with partners outside of government, like Global Affair Canada Independent International Panel on Arbitrary Detention and CSIS's Bipartisan Hostage Commission, to better use existing legal frameworks to target this practice. Together, we're sending a clear message. Our citizens are not human bargaining chips. They are not political pawns. If any country wrongfully holds any of our people, we will hold them accountable. Working with our Canadian friends, we're trying to expand this partnership to make it more inclusive. The Declaration's first ministerial, held at the United Nations General Assembly last fall, co-hosted by Malawi and Costa Rica, welcomed representatives from every part of the world. We're also engaging the private sector to raise awareness of this threat and develop resources to make employees safe while abroad. Now, keep in mind, countries that engage in this practice are also increasingly isolating themselves. Who in their right minds would want to travel to a country, engage in business in a country, work in a country, live in a country that engages in the practice of arbitrary detention? So this is a sure path to pariah status. Now, unfortunately, a number of the countries engaging in this practice are already in that category. But it should be a reminder to each and every one that this is a path that leads to nowhere for them and for all engaged. Now, as Mark mentioned, we're joined today, among others, by Simak Namazi. Before his release last September, Simak was the longest wrongfully detained American in Iran. When he was released, he wrote that in prison, and I quote, he experienced the worst of humanity every day, but outside of those walls, there were countless people who reminded him of the best of humanity. And a number of those people are in this room. Family members, lawyers, neighbors, colleagues, fellow prisoners, strangers from around the world who ensured that he was not forgotten. And through their advocacy, helping him reunite with his loved ones and ultimately return home. Our single most powerful tool to bring people home and deter future detentions is our collective will and our collective action, rooted in our common humanity. Today, that's clearly on display. So I simply want to say I'm grateful to everyone who's here, not just for being here today, but for this ongoing commitment to a singular and important mission. And I'm convinced that through the work that you're doing, through the work that we're doing together, we will not stop until every family is made whole and until this practice stops once and for all. Thank you very much.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for that powerful witness and that reminder that the work that we do is the ultimate in humanizing what is a terrible situation too many times and in too many places. I now have the pleasure of introducing the Honorable Mélanie Joly, Canada's Foreign Minister. She was first elected to the House of Commons in 2015 and previously served as Minister of Economic Development, Minister of Tourism, Official Languages and La Francophonie, and the Minister of Canadian Heritage. As Foreign Minister, she is leading the effort to convince countries to sign on to the Initiative Against Arbitrary Detention. Madame Joly, we are honored to host you, and the floor is officially yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you also, dear Tony. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Bishop, for reminding us that we're all united in our humanity. Of course, I'm happy to be here, particularly because you have a Canadian Institute, I must say, but not only because of that. And I would like to, of course, thank the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, also the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the State Department, and our own folks at Global Affairs Canada. So thank you. And, you know, Tony, you were talking about your Roger, and Roger Costin, and how much he's great. So we all know that. We have our own Joly. So we have Joly Sunday. Joly was recently appointed Senior Official for Hostages Affairs. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for your hard work. And she is now leading our efforts to sharpen our tools at home when our citizens are arbitrarily detained. So you've heard from the ambassador, you've heard from the secretary. This week marks the third anniversary of the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in state-to-state relations. And in just 3 years, we were able to gather 75 countries who are committed to ending the use of arbitrary detention for political leverage. And many of you are here today, and thank you for joining us because it is important work. And together, we're sending a strong message that this practice will not be tolerated. You've heard from Mark and Tony. I will say it as well. Citizens cannot be used as pawns in a geopolitical game. And of course, they cannot be used as bargaining chips. And because we're a bilingual country, allow me to speak French just a second. Soyons clairs, nos citoyens ne sont pas des pions, ni dans le jeu de la géopolitique internationale, ni bien entendu lorsque deux États sont en conflit. Nous devons mettre, bien entendu, fin à la diplomatie des otages. And so we know that arbitrary detention is an awful, reprehensible violation of human rights. It threatens everyone who travels, who works, and lives abroad, no matter which country they call home. And, you know, Tony, you were referring to the horrific experiences of hostages, and thank you so much for being with us today. We know that the experiences scar hostages for life, and also that they lost precious time that they will never get back. We know that there's a lot of physical, psychological, financial, and spiritual even damages that one should never endure. So thank you again for being here. I think they're worth a round of applause, folks. And Jason, it's good to see you again because we saw each other also last September on the margins of Unga. Unfortunately, our two Michaels, Michael Kovac and Michael Spavor, are not here today, but I would also love to highlight how much they've been inspirational as Canadian heroes, and also the work that Vina Najbullah, who has been very much advocating for, of course, their release, but also to bring this issue at the international level, how much her work is important. And I would like to thank her in front of all of you and for all those listening, watching us online. Also, Tony, you were referring to the difficult conversation you had with many families of the hostages also that are held by Hamas. I would like to thank all the work that you've been doing along with Qatar and Egypt on getting to a hostage deal. and also to get humanitarian aid into Gaza. I must say I've had these conversations also with loved ones in Canada that were killed during the October 7th Hamas attacks. And these are one of the most difficult conversations I've had. So I would just like to highlight how much your work is consequential. Thank you so much. So I've highlighted the fact that this is, of course, an international human rights issue, but also arbitrary detention is fundamentally a great threat to the international peace and security, because it goes against every single norm that we as an international community have agreed upon to keep our citizens safe and to bring stability and predictability to the international system. It undermines trust and mutual respect between countries, ripping the seams of friendship between them. And it causes a breakdown in diplomacy, undercutting the peaceful resolution of disputes. The implications reach far beyond the states directly involved in any case. Every instance of hostage diplomacy erodes the rules that are at the foundation of the international system. Rules that have kept us safe since the Second World War, and rules that are fundamental to our collective peace and security. And we need to be looking at this issue for what it is. It is a security threat and a tool of transnational repression. It is a weapon in the arsenal of countries and actors that do not care about international norms or the rule of law. Much as we have seen when it comes to disinformation, cyber attacks, economic coercion, foreign interference, and destabilization tactics. And so, therefore, we cannot allow hostage diplomacy to become a practice that is accepted. And today's event is therefore very important to us. It also builds on the Arbitrary Detention Summit that we co-hosted along with Malawi and Costa Rica on the margins of UNGA. And this is the first time that we're bringing experts together to discuss security implications of hostage diplomacy and to explore how the international community can work together to prevent arbitrary detention. So I hope today is just the beginning of our work together. And my call to action to all of you is let's all take what we learned today and act on it. Let's make sure that this event serves as a catalyst for research and for further discussion on this very important issue. Parce que nous pouvons et devons en faire plus, et notre travail est loin d'être terminé. À tous nos partenaires et alliés dans ce travail, je vous remercie d'avoir pris position avec nous contre cette pratique et d'avoir encouragé d'autres pays à nous rejoindre. And we cannot afford to wait until irreparable damage has been done. We must stand in solidarity against this hostage diplomacy now. Again, a big thank you to our hosts, to our organizers. It's great to be in Washington. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. I want to start by thanking Global Affairs Canada, the State Department, the Woodrow Wilson Center for supporting this event and for being partners all along. I also have to say, it is always such a pleasure for me to see my friends Halas Fandiari, Sia Maknamazi, both of whom were very good friends before their time at Evin Prison. And every time I see them free, it is deeply meaningful to me. Also, I'm happy to see my friend Jason resign. Jason and I are the co-executive directors of the CSS Bipartisan Commission on Hostage Taking and Wrongful Detention. Many of our commissioners are in the room. Others are watching online. Very difficult and important work. But I think the most important work I can be doing, and I'm grateful for their partnership. Jason, as we said, was in Evin Prison for 544 days. I'm tired of having friends who've been in Evin Prison. This really has to stop. We have a remarkable panel to discuss this issue from a security perspective. First, we have Jennifer Daskal. She's Deputy Homeland Security Advisor and Deputy Assistant to the President. She's had a number of administration positions, and before that, worked as a professor of law at American University. My friend Danny Gilbert is an assistant professor of political science at Northwestern, a member of our Bipartisan Hostage Commission, and she previously taught at the Air Force Academy and worked for 4 years on Capitol Hill. Rachel Briggs is co-founder and CEO of Clarity Factory, a consultancy that works with the private sector, governments, foundations, and nonprofits. She is the founding executive director of Hostage US and the first director of Hostage UK, which works to support the families of hostages and wrongly detained individuals. And she was awarded an OBE 10 years ago for her services to hostages and their families. Finally, Professor John Packer is the Neuberger Jessen Professor of International Conflict Resolution at the University of Ottawa. He's worked extensively with the UN and the OSCE on issues related to peace processes, political transitions, conflict prevention and resolution, and human rights. What a great panel. And, I think the way to start is just to start with the practical issues. Jen works these issues every day. Tell me, what's been the administration's approach to wrongful detention, and what tools do you have to respond to the actions that, as the Secretary and the Minister said, are adversaries who aren't playing by the rules and are using American citizens and citizens of other countries as pawns?
Well, thanks, John, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks to the Wilson Center, CSIS, the State Department, especially SPIHA and the entire team, and Canada as well for hosting this really important set of discussions. They're critical. As Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, I've had the opportunity to meet with families who have a loved one unjustly detained abroad. And I can tell you that it is President Biden's priority, truly since day one, to be able to tell each and every one of those families that your loved one is coming home. And over the past 3 years, as you heard Secretary Blinken discuss, we've made enormous progress towards that goal. We've brought more than 60 fellow Americans home from countries all around the world, including Russia, Venezuela, Burma, Afghanistan, Haiti, Rwanda, West Africa, and more. This includes the 45 wrongfully detained individuals that Secretary Blinken mentioned, plus hostages, plus individuals who have been kidnapped for ransom. And we're not stopping there. Our entire team, up to the president, is working constantly to try to secure the release of all of our fellow Americans who remain captive around the world. Now, as I know all of you know, what is required to actually achieve that varies from case to case. Recovering a hostage from terrorists demands a different set of tactics and tools than negotiating the release of a wrongfully detained American who's being held by a nation state. And we've also taken some very important steps to try to prevent and protect against this, John, as you asked about from the beginning. First, President Biden signed an executive order to strengthen the consequences applied against perpetrators who use Americans as pawns. This means more collaboration across the interagency, across the government, and as part of this effort, we announced last year the first ever sanctions against those actors who were engaged in this heinous practice of taking Americans and detaining them wrongfully. As you heard Secretary Blinken discuss, we've worked robustly with international partners on preventing wrongful detentions in the first place. We are among 74 other nations in the EU that have signed the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention and work together to mount collective pressure against the states who engage in this terrible practice. And third, we are taking steps to make sure Americans know not to travel to those kinds of countries that engage in this kind of practice. So the State Department launched a new indicator. It's called the D indicator for do not travel, which warns Americans if there's a high threat of detention in the country which they plan to visit. And that should serve as a warning not to go to that country. And finally, we're doing more than ever to support families from the moment we learn that their loved one has been detained or taken hostage. We work to keep them informed. We do this as an interagency. SPIHA plays a huge role in this. We connect them to support systems. We ask for their feedback and much, much more. And this is critical to be able to provide the support from the families and help support them as they're going through this incredibly painful process. So thank you. Thanks for hosting this panel. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for coming. I'm sure it's an absolutely crazy schedule in the White House, and I'm grateful that you made time for us. Danny, you've thought rigorously about this as a political scientist, as this is a phenomenon of statecraft. How can you help us think about this phenomenon of states using hostage taking as a national security strategy? How do we think about dividing state and non-state actors? I mean, help us wrap our heads intellectually about what's going on here.
Well, thank you so much, John, and thank you to the Wilson Center and all of the co-hosts for having me here today. So as we've heard from all of our speakers so far, what we're talking about here today, whether we call it arbitrary detention or wrongful detention or hostage diplomacy, there are a large set of issues that we're talking about. There are legal problems, there are human rights problems, and this is a security problem as well. So at its basic distillation, hostage taking is conditional detention. It's taking and holding a human captive to coerce someone else to change their behavior. And hostage taking is an ancient crime. It's been around since the earliest written records of war. And over that time, it has shifted from a tactic of states to a tactic of non-state actors. And over the last decade, we've really seen it emerge as a tactic of hostile autocratic state actors once again. In that time, we've seen a wide range of hostage-taking tactics as well, from kidnappings to hijackings to barricade incidents. And in the last decade or so, this phenomenon of wrongful detention, in which states use their criminal justice system to take foreigners hostage. I think of this, in effect, as a form of hostage-taking carried out under the color and guise of law. And it specifically targets, usually, democratic countries who are extremely vulnerable to this form of hostage-taking for several reasons. First of all, democracies like Canada, like the United States, care deeply about the international rule of law and about reciprocity, about an understanding that law means something, that our word means something, and that we won't treat people arbitrarily in the international system. Democracies are also vulnerable because of our values. Governments in democracies care about the health and safety and well-being of their citizens, whether they are at home or abroad. And so they're deeply affected when their citizens are held unjustly and reprehensibly in this way. In democracies, there's also electoral accountability. And so leaders feel pressure from their publics who really can't tolerate to see this kind of detention ongoing. We should, in my opinion, think of wrongful detention as a specific type of hostage-taking because it is using that conditionality, that threat of continuing to hold someone captive in order to coerce a wide range of concessions from government adversaries. And there are a few ways in which it's meaningfully different from some of the other forms of hostage-taking that have been most prominent over the last 50 or 60 years. So things like hijacking or kidnapping are different from hostage diplomacy in meaningful ways. On the one way that it's different is that when someone is kidnapped or hijacked, we might be worried that the hostage will lose their life in captivity. Typically in wrongful detention, it's about time. It's about losing meaningful portions of a person's life. It's the threat, not necessarily of killing the prisoner, but of holding them for years and years and years. In hostage diplomacy and wrongful detention, there's a return address. We know where prisoners are being held. Maybe they're able to speak to their family or speak to a lawyer. But that doesn't mean that they're coming home any faster. In fact, sometimes it means they can be held for much longer periods of time. And there's a very different set of responses that governments can use to bring home those who have been wrongfully detained versus those who are kidnapped by non-state actors, thinking about rescue missions as a potential option for hostages held by non-state actors, whereas a much wider range of concessions are frankly on the table when we're talking about state perpetrators. I'll end just talking about a couple of trends that we've seen in the last decade as wrongful detention and hostage diplomacy have been on the rise. So we know that there are many more cases of this than we frankly used to see. And that might be because we have named it, we're starting to count it. We have events like this that we are bringing attention to it. But frankly, I see it as just the latest form of hostage taking, which actors will adopt because they know it works against their stronger democratic adversaries. And we also see it on the rise as a shift from the global war on terror, from insurgencies that frequently use kidnappings, to a return of strategic competition, where most of the security focus in the international realm is state-to-state competition once again. The targets of hostage diplomacy are typically people who have an extraordinary amount of experience in the countries where they are being held captive. They work there, they might live there, they have families there, they might be dual nationals, journalists, aid workers, NGOs, people who should be off limits for this kind of behavior. And finally, while there are an established collection of autocratic perpetrators who are using this tactic similarly, they seem to want different sets of things from their hostage-taking actions, some interested in one-on-one prisoner swaps, whereas some other countries, like Iran, typically seem to be coercing a wider set of concessions as part of geopolitical deals.
Thank you, Danny. It's a lot to think about. I think a lot of very helpful framing, and you gave us a sense for the motivation of the guys doing this. When Rachel and I were having a conversation last week, she pointed out this is basically about states breaking rules. So the states that follow the rules, what's your sense about the direction that states can and should be taking to enforce rules against states that don't want to abide by rules?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'll perhaps before I jump straight into that, I just wanted to emphasize how important the framing of today's event is. For those of us who have been working on these issues for 10, 15, 20 years, we started to see these cases emerge bit by bit. There was one in Iran, something funny was going on in China, somebody seemed to be caught up in Russia for no good reason. We started to see this trend emerging, somewhat the canary in the coal mine. And over time, as Danny said, we've started to name this thing and we've started to see it emerging. We understand it now as a trend. But I think it's really important that we do see this as the thin end of a much bigger wedge. This is a group of countries who are using arbitrary detention, and they're also using a heck of a lot of other tools in their toolbox that they shouldn't be using to be aggressive, to behave in a way, to push buttons and to get their own way. And so it's very important, actually, that we frame this in this broader context. It is not just about finding ways to bring home people who were arrested, seized for no other good reason than the colour of their passport. And that comes from somebody who's dedicated the last 20 years to working on that issue. Getting people home is critically important, most important objective here. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that this is just one of the tools in the toolbox of a group of countries who have decided to heck with the international rule of law, to heck with the rules that everybody else is applying by. We're going to do things differently. And that has to frame how we respond to this. And what it means is that our responses have to be the following. They've got to be very serious. They've got to be absolutely sustained. They've got to be incredibly well-resourced. They've got to be very creative. We've got to do some creative stuff here because we are dealing with people who are being very creative around the rules. And finally, they've got to be courageous. We've got to get really comfortable with being uncomfortable in the way that we deal with these issues. We must not get into our safe space, our cozy space. We've got to get really courageous and really uncomfortable and really creative. And to answer your question, John, what can we do? There was two things that I wanted to highlight, and perhaps some other stuff I hope might come up in conversation. And I wanted to start with the importance of getting ourselves coordinated. And let me start within the national sphere to start with. I had the pleasure of living in the US for 5 years, 2015 to 2020, as I was setting up and running Hostage US, handed it off now to my incredible former co-worker, Liz Cathcart. And what I saw during that period was a 180-degree turnaround within the US government. I mean, pretty extraordinary. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of having that office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, somebody who is able to have a singular focus, has one agenda item, and it's always the same item. And, you know, in these issues, you know, of course there's bilateral concerns, there's trade deals, there's this, that. Of course, let's be honest and grown up about this, there are always competing demands around that table. So having somebody who's only got one agenda item and they're just going to keep repeating it over and over again is incredibly important, and it gets this the attention that it deserves. It also has done an extraordinary job of building up expertise. And while it is true to say that each case has its uniquenesses, there is a trend here. And having an office, having a collective place where all of that institutional memory comes, so it doesn't get lost when somebody gets rotated out of the job. It doesn't, you know, what we learn in Iran doesn't get sort of lost in how we're dealing with Russia and vice versa, although there are differences. We centralize our knowledge together. There's a continuity, and you have a team of people who are able to see, recognize and communicate the reality, which is there are trends across both cases, country and time. And it's really important that we don't lose that knowledge. The two things that I wanted to point out as being really special features of that particular institutional arrangement is the following. One is pitching it at the right level. You have to have somebody in that role who has the ear of every single decision maker they need to reach. So seniority matters, I'm afraid. You've got to have influence. You've got to have the ability to get in the door and get around the table and be heard. And the second thing that's really important, and I really applaud the way that Ambassador Carstens has gone about this, because this wasn't a given, which is about bringing together a team of all the talents. And I have to say, it's one of the things I really tip my hat to you Americans about, because your willingness to bring around the table yourselves, of course, business people, journalists, NGOs, former hostages, their families, anybody, influencers, diaspora communities. And I think having that attitude, which is, this is a very complicated problem, we need to get everybody around the table who's got a slither of expertise, influence that they might bring to bear to make the impossible happen. So that team of all the talents is incredibly important. To close, there's one, and I should note as well that I know a number of other countries are now following the model that we have in the US. It's something I've called on for years now, and I'm so thankful to see that this is happening. And I can't understand why any country that is touched by this problem would not have that institutional arrangement. And then, secondly, on a very practical level, you know, we heard from our politicians earlier in the event the importance of this coalition of working together internationally. Great job in bringing together all those countries. I mean, it's a coalition of the coalition. It's an extraordinary collection of countries standing united against this. And it's time to operationalize things. It's time to not just say, how do we as one country get our house in order and be as efficient and productive as humanly possible. It's about then saying, when things are happening operationally around the world, how do we, as Americans, as Canadians, as Brits, as French, as Germans, as Japanese, how do we come together as a hot team? Of course, we've got our own interests, but what does it mean when I, as a Brit, make a certain decision, what does that mean for that person that you're trying to get out in the same circumstance? How can we share information? How can we tag team? How can we try and do a deal together? How can we really not just be really efficient and productive ourselves as countries, but how can we bring that same ethos and that same team of all the talents together every single time this happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. And I hope that if anything positive can come out of the truly dreadful events in Gaza and those poor hostages who we are still trying to come home, I hope that maybe it is in a time-limited, highly pressured situation that governments have, whether they feel forced to do so or whether they have willingly done so, they have absolutely realised the power of operationally together, coming together in real time, tag teaming. If it happens to one, it happens to all. And so I hope we can see that concept so beautifully personified through the office of the SPIHA, maybe becoming something that becomes operationalised in individual cases internationally as well.
Thank you, Rachel. John, you have served in an alphabet soup of international organizations and institutions, and you've thought deeply about how international relations works in a practical way. And I was wondering first if you could address the issue that Rachel sort of highlighted about international cooperation. Where should we institutionalize it? Where should we do it? Is it important that it's sort of tied to an institution or several institutions? How do we complement it? And I think the other piece is when you have countries that are breaking the rules, they've decided to break the rules. Mm-hmm. What does that mean about how the international community is working? Is there a community? And if there's not, what do we do about that?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation to join this important conversation, and thank you for the opportunity to share some views. I have to say that my own observation is it's not good out there. The trends fundamentally are not conducive. It is a valid question. Is there an international community? This is a phrase we use. I would suggest there isn't. There are communities. One of the features of the world in which we live in is increasingly complex inter- and non-dependencies. We see, for example, separations increasingly, divisions. I'm not so encouraged, I'm sorry to say, by the 70 or so countries that have signed up to the declaration that Canada initiated, because I know, and we should all know, that the basic prohibition of arbitrary detention is well established already from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I mean, the normative side is well established, almost universally agreed. And it kind of begs the question, where's the other 120 countries that are hesitating to sign on to this, right? And I think the answer is because they're not really sold on it anymore. I mean, we've just seen Russia pulling out not only of the Council of Europe, but now out of specific instruments like the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities, giving up on the Moscow mechanism in the OSCE, and so forth and so on. So we have to countenance the fact here that the world is messy. And as a former boss of mine once told me, he said, we don't only have friends, which is to say we increasingly have enemies. There are those who are opposed. There are actors who are not acting in good faith. They're acting in positively bad faith. There are those who are profiting from the instability, the deterioration. They are sowing the seeds, and they are utilizing exactly these fissures, fractures. They want them to be fissures in the international system. So this is obviously problematical. I would go a step further to say a feature I can disclose to you that I also sit on the board of Human Rights Watch Canada. And the methodology of many human rights organizations has been based on this idea of mobilizing shame. If we would reveal, expose, and so forth. We're living in a shameless world. So that thesis, or the theory of change, is not very useful or instrumental if we talk about operationalizing. We have to rethink, how do you operationalize in a situation where you're actually dealing with bad actors in terms of their intentions and their faith. So how to do this? I'm not so sold. I mean, I worked for almost 10 years in the OSCE. I was a legal advisor and director of the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities, still a lot of a tailored institution that has a little lesson from it, because when that institution was created in 1992 in the Second Helsinki Summit after the Cold War, they carefully circumscribed the mandate. And they said it's not for national minorities, it was on situations affecting relations between states. And then they precluded actually acting on individual cases, interestingly enough, to kind of engage in these problematical situations. The reason I say that is because I think it's very important to make qualitative distinctions here. I first was involved with just one sentence on this, with hostage taking in Iraq in the early 1990s. I was assistant to the first UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iraq, went to Abu Ghraib prison, and there was a guy, a Brit, who had bicycled into northern Iraq, oblivious to the situation in the world. The Iraqis put him in jail, Abu Ghraib, and slapped a 20-year sentence on him and instrumentalized him. They wouldn't have cared too much before. They would get the guy out, some penalty. They instrumentalized him for interstate relations. That's a very different thing than when I worked in Yemen, and there were Americans taken hostage by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, who were either doing it for money or for local political reasons. That's simply a different qualitative matter. And I think we need to make that distinction. I think Professor Gilbert has written about. Now, how do we do this? I'm not sure that a kind of universalist approach at this moment in time is going to be effective. The list of the, if I may say, bad actors is growing. Read Freedom House reports, 20 years of diminished democracies and so forth. So I think we have to really look at tailoring how we respond, not only with those actors who are going to understand what is problematical about this for real international relations. Even bad actors have interests in real international relations. And second element in that is not only what the norm element would be, but I think we have to think about what are effective recourses. At the moment, it's not clear to me where you go with this kind of problem, except specific domestic institutions, such as here. Is there some place to go? That could be early, the preventive argument, could be effective. There are certain means of quiet. I'm not sure that we need to legalize this, but we need to have some kind of investment in it. I think we probably, for all of this, need some more tailored and specific research about the kinds of cases, what exactly is happening, what works, where, and why, and I'm not sure that we have that at the moment.
Thank you. Jen, one of the themes here is the bad guys are learning.
Yes.
So what have we learned works, and how do we keep a step ahead of the bad guys?
Thanks. I mean, I strongly agree with the end of the last statement, which is that the cases are not the same. The cases are different. And one of the reasons why I think it takes so long sometimes to figure out these cases is because the actors on the other side are different. They have different interests. They have different personalities. They have different strategic interests. And in each and every case, we are in a position of trying to figure out what the position is of the other side and come to a resolution where, in the particular interest of getting our Americans home, we can achieve that. So I think there's not a single answer to the problem of bringing Americans home or bringing any other nationals home. If there were, this would be a much easier problem to deal with, unfortunately. And our job, my job, the job of SPIHA, the job of many others across the U.S. government and elsewhere is to work continuously to try to figure out what those levers are and take the opportunities when they arise. We also, as I said, think about how we try to protect against additional arbitrary detentions and additional hostages. And I think the D notice, the State Department notices of do not travel are important. Americans should not travel to countries that have a level 4 do not travel warning. I do think having nations stand together and collectively condemn countries that are engaged in these practices matters. I also think that President Biden's executive order and the subsequent issuance of sanctions against those, for the first time ever, starting in May of 2023, against those who were engaged in these practices, matters. We're not going to solve this problem overnight, unfortunately, but we can keep trying. I can tell you that President Biden is committed to trying. It is a top priority. And I can tell you that Roger, who's sitting here nodding, is committed to trying. And there are people across the U.S. government that are deeply committed to working on these issues.
I was wondering, I can ask, and this is open to anybody. I mean, to me, it's notable that some of the countries that seem to have embraced this are countries like Russia and China that have complicated, often adversarial relations with the United States, but a lot that they can hold at risk. Are they trying to change the nature of our relationships? Are they just trying to gain marginal advantage? If we think broadly about national security issues and international relations, is this a big thing by big countries or a small thing by big countries that just want a huge basket of things to draw from? I'm happy to have anybody.
Just a few quick reactions to that. So, first of all, allow me to clarify that I fully agree. I think it was very important, and I remember watching on television the mobilization by the Canadian government in Beijing of representative states standing together saying, we're watching and we don't accept this. That's different than saying, is there a norm that we're elaborating? If you can't get everyone around that norm, you're in trouble. So this is all that I'm pointing out is where, and the arbitrary detention norm as such is a well-established norm. So there's something else here we have to pay attention to. No, what I want to say is I think it's very hard to answer the question because a lot of the cases have specificity. The two Michaels and Huawei CEO. Very peculiar situation in terms of who particularly on the Chinese side, we were talking about, right? So how much that's why I think we need more research, is to really kind of drill down a bit and categorize here sensibly. Are there peculiarities about certain persons, conditions, cases, types of states? And by the way, increasingly non-state, right? I mean, the world is getting more and more. It was your Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who gave us the fragile, failing, and so forth. If you look at actually indices, there are more and more states in that fat category of failing, fragile, uncertain, and there's a whole lot of non-state actors in between there that don't adhere to these norms and so forth. So I think we need the specificity is problematical, but I also notice the asymmetrical aspect of this. So what's happening here is that the weaker actors in some ways, even if they're maybe not weaker, like China has powerful levers it could use, but they're kind of reverting to a pretty kind of unsophisticated, hostage taking goes back time immemorial. Tribal groups, the pre-state, have done this, right? And so forth. This is not sophisticated in its essential character. And also the other element here is not just the asymmetrical. There is an interest of some actors purposefully to destabilize, to sow the seeds. So you're not going to solve that problem by better norms, better mechanisms. No, their position is they're delighted with precisely the kind of mischief that this causes.
Yeah, I would align myself with much of what John said. So it's been interesting to me as an observer that when we think about Russia and China specifically in their use of this, yes, they are weaker actors than the United States, but they're not weak actors. It's been interesting that the way that those cases have unfolded have largely been 1-for-1 or 1-for-2 prisoner swaps. We have not seen, my colleagues here who know what happens behind the scenes might know differently, but we haven't seen the resolution of these cases be for larger geopolitical concessions or other kinds of things that those states could plausibly demand. And I think that's a very good thing. They're making this about something specific. They would accuse us of doing it first or doing it too. That the two Michaels case, they would say, started with the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. And in many of these cases, they point fingers and say that you do this as well. And so that is a rhetorical claim that is undermining this understanding of the rules and kind of questioning global leadership of the West, of the liberal international order, and things like that. And in addition to coercing these concessions, it serves to embarrass leaders as well. It's not exclusively about getting that prisoner back or getting that concession, but about making things exceptionally difficult for leaders of democratic states.
Rachel, I was struck by your comment that we need to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Is part of that not playing by the rules ourselves? And what does that look like?
Such a good question. Well, I'm gonna veer away from the deterrence question part of what you're asking, because that's just not my field of expertise. And this is such an important and critical policy issue that I think it's imperative on all of us not to stray into territory where we're out of our expertise level. So I'm going to put that to one side, and others might answer your question from that perspective. I think we have to get uncomfortable with being. We have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because we've got to behave in different ways. So I'm not necessarily saying, by any stretch of the imagination, we must start breaking international laws and we must sort of rip up treaties. Of course we're not. I mean, I'm very much of the school of thinking, when they go low, we go high. I mean, we have to remain ourselves. We have to maintain our values. We have to be true to ourselves in the face of this dreadful activity. But it does, on many levels, it requires us to do things that we haven't been used to doing. I talked about, having a team of all the talents. Now, on paper, that's a really uncomfortable thing for somebody to do who has clearance in the State Department or the White House. The prospect of bringing around the table a group of people who are not cleared, who are not necessarily inside the foreign policy tent day in, day out, on what is an incredibly sensitive area of national security, you take risks. And I've seen it in practice, not just here, but in my own country back in the UK, individuals taking risks on bringing you in, sharing stuff that maybe on paper they shouldn't be sharing with you, but they know they can trust you, and what will come from that is a positive outcome somewhere down the road. So there's a whole set of behaviours, there's a whole set of activities that will be crucially important to solving this problem, whether it's bringing somebody home, preventing people from travelling in the first place, or deterring this activity from happening at all, which requires people with security clearance getting comfortable dealing with people who don't have security clearance, people who work in the private sector feeling comfortable coming into the State Department to work on, help in a way on government type stuff. It's not just government that sort of has to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. But if we don't get creative in this space, if we're not willing to kind of rip up some of the rules, not the laws, not the international frameworks, but if we're not willing to rip up some of those rules about how we're supposed to behave and who's supposed to be in the room and who's supposed to do what, we just simply won't solve this. And so that was what I was getting at. I'm absolutely not advocating that we sort of start behaving like them, but they are being very creative, and if we don't get creative quickly, we're just not going to solve the problem.
Okay, I think we have some note cards. If people have questions, we'll try to get a few questions in before we have to break, and I guess we're running a little bit late, so we'll try to move things along. What does hostage taking mean for the way international security is evolving? We all talked about how this is happening more and more. Is it just going to be a messier and more lawless space? And if so, what can we do to bring it back?
Yeah, before we go there, I want to respond to Rachel's comment, because I want to be clear. We do not endorse sharing classified information or sharing particularly sensitive information externally. That said, I meet with families, Roger and his team meet with families, we talk to people from the outside, and particularly in some of these hard cases, we embrace, we want to hear the ideas that the families bring to us. We want to hear the ideas that other people bring to us. Having families put pressure and apply leverage in the right place can be extraordinarily useful. So I think, well, again, we don't endorse sharing information that is protected or privileged, absolutely think that it is essential that we have conversations, and we do have those conversations with a range of actors, and that's an important part of how we work on some of these cases.
So what does, John, you were nodding. I mean, what does this mean for the way we should expect countries to be engaging with each other? Is this going to be a trend where there's just more messiness and lawlessness and shamelessness?
I think that is a trend at the moment. I don't see it going the other way. I actually see most international organizations becoming destabilized, thinner in their normative coherence. I mean, a lot of questions. Will the OSCE survive this year? It hasn't been budgeted for 2 or 3 years. Right now, the institutions only have 9-month mandates. The UN, the Security Council, and so forth. We could have long conversations, but many organizations at the multilateral level are really having a tough time, and I think that's just a reflection of the realities of the world. The consensuses are thin. Now, what do we do about that? I mean, we faced these periods before. Historically, the world has, and even on this specific topic, I was struck by something that Danny wrote, because I almost forgot that hijacking was like a routine thing when about 40 years ago. When I certainly remember
When we were young.
Yeah, when we were young. I mean, it was almost a weekly thing, right, on the news. And it's so much so, I fly a lot, like probably many people here. It almost doesn't enter my mind anymore that there's going to be a hijacking. There's other things I worry about, but not hijacking. There were some simple things which were done that technically addressed that, but that was also in a period of coherence coming together at the end of the Cold War, which they gave rise to the 90s and so forth. I'm not sure there's a simple technical fix on this, like carrier sanctions or things like that. But I do think it is worth considering. For example, I'm struck that I don't think there's been a review of conventional diplomatic relations or the convention on consular relations in quite a long time. I don't know if it's worth their tailoring some kind of, things evolve. People might be surprised to know that, often we talk about the Geneva Conventions, then we talk about the 2 additional protocols. But there was a 3rd protocol adopted about 10 or 15 years ago on symbols, because it had to do with the reality of things changing. So maybe we need to tweak something here. I don't know. Maybe it's not a hard law instrument. Maybe we need some kind of a consensus document on specifically interstate relations. This is disruptive. It is problematical, but we have bad actors. I don't know the answer for it. I think we have to think about it. We have to do research. And I'm pretty convinced, ultimately, we live in a complex and interdependent world, and the costs of this are probably going to mount if they continue.
So let me ask a question about costs. We got a really important question from the audience. How do we balance the difficult calculation of swaps in individual cases versus the risk of incentivizing this practice? And of course, swaps is sometimes individuals, and sometimes it's paying ransom, essentially. How do we think about unpacking that problem? How do we make sure we're not creating the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah, I might have something to add here, which is that from my experience of working not just these cases, but kidnap for ransom cases, looking back over many years, what strikes me is that it's really important that we distinguish between that which we do to get somebody home and the imperatives which sit around that, around protection of life, the state's role to protect its citizens, and so on and so forth, and then what we do to end the crime. And too often, we conflate the two and say, well, we end the crime by doing something different in the negotiation piece. We end the crime by not conceding. In those countries, and this is talking about kidnap for ransom countries, and I know that the parallel isn't exactly the same, but in those countries that, for example, banned ransom payments, made it illegal, it did not end the crime. It sent it underground, and it made it much more dangerous, much more complicated for families. And essentially what was realised in those countries where it had become endemic was the way that we solve this is by tackling the root causes. What is it that sort of creates this economy? Let's unpack that. And that was ultimately how those problems were solved. And I think that, while these are different types of cases, there are some similarities here. Now, in kidnap for ransom cases where it's about money, I can tell you categorically, if one of my loved ones is taken, as actually they were 30 years ago, I would remortgage my home, I would sell all of my possessions, I would do whatever I absolutely could to get them home. Now, you don't have as much of that leverage in state hostage cases because of what's being asked and who's round the table. But it is not completely unknown for families to be able to solve these cases themselves. I can think of a number of examples off the top of my head where actually options were possible that didn't go through government. And so this is why this crime is the perfect crime, because you take one individual and you say, well, it's just one individual, but actually it embodies so much more, and the family at the heart of this will do anything to get that person home. And so you have to decouple that which you do to get somebody home from that which you do to end the crime. And it's really not helpful, in my view, to conflate the two.
Any other thoughts on how we don't incentivize the very problem we try to solve?
I will align myself entirely with everything that Rachel said. I think that a no concessions logic sounds quite appealing, right? We shouldn't reward bad actors. We worry that it incentivizes more violence, but it punishes the family. It punishes the hostage or the detainee. It is a temporal trade-off between the person who is actually being held captive today versus the potential captives of tomorrow. And there is a major collective action problem. There is always this incentive to cheat. Someone is always willing to pay when it's their loved one's life who is on the line. And so making concessions or negotiating works to bring people home, as distasteful as that might be, but it works to bring people home. And so how do we think more broadly about a strategy that on the one hand is bringing our people home, and thinking more broadly, the second panel today is going to talk about it, how do we deter this practice going forward? How do we condition other countries to change their behavior and work collectively to end the practice once and for all?
Yeah, I'll just add that the evidence doesn't bear out the premise. So the evidence does not bear out that when we negotiate and we bring an American home, that the country immediately goes back and picks up another American. That's just not what happens. You look at the 60 people that this administration's brought home. We have, obviously there have been some particular actors that have engaged in repeat bad actions, heinous actions, but we're just as a whole, as a trend, it's just not what we're seeing. So I just don't think the evidence bears out the premise.
Okay, I could do this all afternoon, but we're actually running a little bit behind schedule. So let me apologize to people whose excellent questions, I didn't get to ask. Let me very much thank the panelists, and again thank the Wilson Center Global Affairs Canada for their partnership on this, and we look forward to the next panel with my friend Marissa. Thank you.
So if I could ask everyone to take their seats, and we'll get this second panel going. If the first panel set us up nicely to talk about the problem, the second panel, I think, has a very important message, which is about what we do about it. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you my colleague here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, the director of our Middle East program, Marissa Kerma. Over to you, Marissa.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks to all of you for tuning in online as well. A reminder to all of you, actually, that you can also submit comments and questions. I'm really delighted to be moderating this conversation today and to continue the discussion that we started earlier with speeches by Secretary of State and Foreign Minister Joly, but also the discussion that just took place. So this panel will focus on exploring the frameworks and collective responses against arbitrary detention, so very much continuing the conversation further. So I'm delighted to welcome Jason Rezaian, who's a former Washington Post correspondent in Iran, where he was detained for 544 days and released in January of 2016. Jason currently writes for the Washington Post and is also a CNN contributor. Ambassador Louise Blais, who served as Canada's Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations in New York, York from 2017 until 2021, and is currently Senior Business Advisor to the Business Council of Canada. And Lara Simons, who, as Chief Executive of Hostage International, has extensive experience in directly assisting families who've been affected by either kidnap or arbitrary detention, and in also supporting former hostages and detainees. And we've heard our previous panelists discuss how important families play, the role they play in all of this and how they're impacted by this. So welcome and thanks to all of you. So I'd like to kick off the conversation with basically, the issue of collective response to hostage taking or hostage diplomacy. I'm reminded by Rachel's statement on the importance of framing, and perhaps that's another conversation to have. But how can collective responses fortify our shared security? And what does that collective response actually look like? Is it led primarily by states, and who are the states that should lead it and participate in it? And Jason, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I look around, see a lot of friends, a lot of former hostages, people who have worked on my case and other cases. I'm reminded that 8 years after my release, we're growing a very substantial and robust community. And I think where it starts for me in terms of collective response is having a clear understanding of what it is that we're talking about, both in terms of the government responses. As the last panelist indicated, the motivations for different states that do this differ. So the responses necessarily also need to differ. But also in how we talk about it publicly when another person is taken. When I was detained 10 years ago in Iran, after I came back and read a lot of the statements made by U.S. officials, I was very bothered by how it was characterized. And I think that that's a common sentiment shared by many of us. And fortunately, that's changed a lot because of a lot of advocacy, but also a lot of communication and dialogue between us and the stakeholders in government who are tasked with bringing people home. Call it what it is. This is hostage taking. Terms like arbitrary detention, wrongful detention, confuse people, confuse the public. As someone who writes about these cases on a weekly basis, I know that the average American doesn't care when you hear the term wrongfully detained or arbitrarily detained. That person must have done something wrong to get themselves detained. When you hear the term hostage, you're talking about a whole different thing. And I think just to say one more thing, these responses need to be collective and coordinated in the same way the hostage taking by states is coordinated. In the cases of my friends Hale and Siamak sitting in the front, friend Nazar Zaka in the back, everybody can attest to the fact that every aspect of the Iranian state was mobilized against us. Their intelligence gathering services, their law enforcement, their judiciary, their executive branch, their parliament, their state media, propaganda apparati. We don't have that same coordinated response yet. I feel like we're getting there, but still, this is very much a work in progress.
Thank you, Jason. Louise, you also were at the helm at the UN when a lot of these discussions were taking place. How do you get more states involved? Because collective response involves getting more people on board. And of course, they have to be part of the declaration. There's also the operationalization, which we heard earlier in the panel. So what does that look like, and who should be leading?
So thank you very much, Marissa. I'm really happy to be here. I'm sorry that I will have to leave at 3:30, but I'll be brief in my remarks because so much has been said already. I think the first panel was absolutely spot on. Couldn't agree with everything more. And specifically, obviously, to John's point about the world has changed, the bad actors are clearly not signing the declaration. They're clearly not respecting international law. We already have the framework necessary, legal and otherwise, internationally. They just choose to disregard it, and they have very little consequence when it comes to it. If anything, they're incentivized. So that really does limit what you can do and who can lead. And certainly, I believe that we have to, and this is going to sound a little harsh, but I think what we need to do is we need to try to find a way to remove emotions, bring back to really strategic interests. And where I would see the UN, where I have a lot of experience, would be to try to get the UN involved in advocating for specific cases. Remove the state, not the families, we can never do that, but try to have a mediator so that you diffuse the amount of leverage that these actors have over the democracies that we're talking about. So could we put a middle person and say, you talk to the hand until we're ready to talk to you? Is there ways in which we can be a little bit tougher in our response while making sure that we don't put the safety of the hostage in jeopardy? So obviously that has to be nuanced, it has to be done. I think that something as well that John alluded to, I think we need to modernize the instruments that we do have. They are there, but I think the convention against, I can't remember the term, the hostage convention as it's referred to from 1979 needs to be updated, needs to reflect more the cases that we're seeing today. I think there has to be more pressure. Even if we know that it doesn't work, doesn't matter. We should continue to do it. I would options that are there is go back and get another resolution inside the General Assembly that basically, based on the declaration, but condemns this practice. It would be to maybe even advocate for a special session of the General Assembly against this practice. Whether it would be United States and Canada asking for that, probably not. This is maybe the good way not to get it. But we have to find where our allies are here and who's willing to put some skin in the game without us being always at the forefront. I think we have to get better in our diplomacy. We have to listen more. There's a lot of countries around the world, even those that have signed, that are tired to be told what to do, that we need them to be on board to things that matter to us. And there has to be that two-way street. And later on, I'll talk about the business sector and how we can weave that in. But that's where I would start. It's not because it's not working that we can't continue to shame. I think we have to continue to shame. I think if we don't, then we've just abdicated. I think we've got instruments to do that, but at the same time, behind the scenes, we've got to toughen up, and we have to remove the leverage that these actors have over one country, one leader, because it can and it has in the past influenced elections. So it's tough. It's tough business.
Absolutely, and use the mechanisms that are already there, but also not be afraid to reform what is needed to reform or create new ones. As we heard, creativity is key to all the tools that are at our disposal. Lara, you had Hostage International, so this is an international NGO. You work with the families. How can they be part of the collective response, and how can other NGOs can also be part of that collective response, working hand in hand with the states at the forefront of this effort?
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our hosts for inviting me to this panel today. The role of the family is critical in this. I think it's been alluded to previously in the previous panel and also by our keynote speakers. The family and the hostage are always at the center of an arbitrary detention or any type of hostage taking. They are the ones who are paying the biggest price for this. They are the main stakeholders. They are the ones who are not only suffering during those first weeks, months, and unfortunately years that arbitrary detentions go on for, but, and many of us forget this, the aftermath of that as well. When a case ends and a hostage comes home, it's the end of that case for everybody else, and they go on to the next matter. For the family and the hostage, there are years of recovery ahead of them. They have to rebuild their lives. They can't go back to the lives they had before. And they will have a trauma that they have to live with. Both the families and the hostages live that trauma, and they have to live with that for years. At Hostage International, we have people coming to us more than 30 years after an event, a hostage-taking event, to seek support. So that is how much that trauma affects them, and we must never forget that. So how do we involve families in this? Obviously, the hostage is another matter we can come to in a minute, and Jason can speak for that. But how do we involve families in a way that is going to help the overall response? It's by bringing them to the table. They have to be partners in this process. They cannot be shut out. And I think, again, the previous panel alluded to that being very important. So what do? We bring them to the table. They are shared information, not classified information, but information that we've seen this in kidnap cases, and we can do a comparison between kidnap cases where governments are potentially more able to share or more willing to share because they see it as a security threat rather than a consular matter. In many of those cases, governments have brought the family in. They've told them what the perpetrators' modus operandi is, what their tactics are, what their demands are. They have said, these are your options as a family. This is what you can do. These are options as government. And they listen to the family. The family doesn't only bring themselves to the table. Families have other connections too that they can leverage. There might be the employers who are out there working on behalf of their employee to bring them home. There will also be media contacts. There will be civil society who have information that's really important as well. So the family is there as a stakeholder, but also someone who's going to bring a cross-sector approach to the resolution and to the response. Obviously, ultimately, this is a resolution that is going to be carried out by governments in arbitrary state arbitrary detention. But it's incredibly important to recognise that families have to have that role. And SPIHA in the United States had the creation in 2015 of the U.S. response to criticism of past cases where they did not bring the family to the table, and with terrible results for the family and the hostages. They have taken that feedback on board and have now got a response that is the same for both hostage takings, kidnaps, and non-state actors kidnaps, and also state hostage takings. And that opens up possibilities for a more collective response too.
Thank you for that. And Louise, I know I'm mindful also that you have to leave earlier, so I want to get back to you because you also mentioned, in addition to the role of states, there's also a very important role for the private sector or businesses. So can you elaborate on that?
Sure, happy to. Well, first of all, I mean, before I mention we're talking about we're talking about security impact of this practice. We have to start talking about the economic impact of this practice. And I think this is where we do have leverage, what I was talking about. And China now is overplaying its hand. And it is now making it difficult for Western companies to be doing business there because they're picking up business people and accusing them of spying. So making the case for the business impact to those who are practicing this, I think is important. I think we have to put our money where our mouth is, I think a little bit in this case, and be prepared sometimes to have difficult conversations between business, companies, and the government. And when we talk about security issues, and that they can take all sorts of shapes and sizes, it's everything about practice, how you conduct yourself in a country that could be dangerous. It's how much business you get to do. We don't have in Canada, and I don't believe you have in the United States. We have limited tools when it comes to preventing our companies to invest in these countries. I mean, there's sanctions, and that obviously is a no-go. Yeah. But in between all this, we really, that's, I'm not saying that this is the position of the Business Council of Canada, mind you, but these are conversations that we should be having between the government and business sector to see, because the money talks. And a lot of American and Canadian companies are very big in some of these countries, obviously not Iran, but in others. And then this is an area where I think there should be more collaboration so that we have more tools, more leverage. Since I have the floor, I will add something I didn't mention earlier. I was at the UN when 3 years ago we were trying to get as many names as possible to sign up to the declaration. It was a Monday morning when it was going to go out live on the website. The minister was going to make an announcement. And that morning, before 7 a.m., I got 3 phone calls from ambassadors from different countries. And I don't mind saying this publicly because it needs to be said, calling me and panicked to say, please remove our name. And can you do it? Can you do it? Can you do it? I was like, well, I'm in New York. I'm going to have to call Ottawa. Yeah, we'll try to make sure it's not on the website. And it was one of them told me where this was coming from. And this is what we're facing. But what I thought to myself was, okay, we're not getting these names on the declaration, but this country that's been coerced and not signing on to it, we force somebody's hand to show their true hands. And that is worth something because there's only so many times you can use your currency internationally. And every time we force these bad actors to use their currency, they have less money, they have less to use on something else. So it's still, even if we are doing these things that may or may not, and you look, obviously those that are involved in this are not signing to it. It doesn't matter. We're forcing the issue. We're making them pay a price. And I think that's an important thing to continue to do.
So speaking of tools at our disposal, Louise mentioned businesses in the private sector. Jason, what other tools are there that can be mobilized to ensure that the collective response is more fortified?
I think there's quite a few of them. I mean, first, we have the global Magnitsky sanctions that can be activated, and for whatever reason, governments are loath to use those so far in wrongful detention cases. Here in the United States, we have our legal system, and some of you might know that I and others have massive judgments against the Islamic Republic of Iran, but essentially that's just a piece of paper that our justice system has decided not to use as leverage against Iran. And these judgments are usually in the form of punitive damages, literally designed to punish, right? Yeah. I think we have to get a lot more comfortable about creating real costs for this behavior, because a conversation that I've had often with many people in this room is that there's currently no real cost. And I agree 100% with my dear friend Rachel that we have to do everything that we can to bring individuals home. Sometimes that's going to include concessions that we don't feel very good about giving. But on that same timeline, we have to be thinking about how and what are we going to do to make this harder moving forward. And, I think we have to get very creative. Another, discussion that some of us have had about getting the business community involved. One of the previous panelists talked about the D-designation that the State Department has for countries that do wrongful detention. What about airline tax for those countries? Millions of people travel to China every year. Millions of people travel to Iran. You don't think millions of people travel to Iran, but a lot of people do. And would increasing the cost, not in just a nominal way, but maybe double the price of a ticket to one of these countries, deter some people from going? Certainly. And would that sort of lowering of foreign currency income to countries like Iran matter? Yeah, it'd matter a lot. So I think it requires thinking outside the box and expanding the toolkit that we have available to us.
And Lara, what does that look like from your perspective, given the work that you do so closely with families? What are some of the ideas that have come about to just expand that toolbox?
Yeah. Well, from my perspective, I think, and thinking about the position of families, I think the biggest hurdle or challenge to collective response is the lack of very clear criteria about designating arbitrary detention as such by individual governments. And that's at the national level, but also even at the international level. So families face a situation where their loved one is detained in dubious circumstances, and they expect their government to have very clear assessment rules for deciding what that situation is, it's an arbitrary detention, and what response that triggers by their government. Sadly, that is absent in almost everywhere. Again, the US is an exception with having the Levinson Act, which makes that criteria very clear for Americans about whether that is going to be a wrongful detention or not, and what then happens if it is. Mm-hmm. That isn't the case for many families in other countries. And what is their option then? There is a tool for them. They can petition the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions. Mm-hmm. And the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions does not have a specific category for state hostage takings, but it can rule on whether that detention is arbitrary. And that means that it's in contravention of international law. So when a family gets that legal ruling from the UN, it's hugely powerful for them. It validates their position and that of the hostage. This is wrong. This is illegal. Sadly, and I think this is where it's an underutilized tool by governments. Mm-hmm. A lot of governments think that is something the family can do and leave them to it. We're continuing with our strategy of dealing with the detaining state. However, they can use that because whilst many other countries, including like-minded countries, may not necessarily adhere to one's national criteria for assessing a detention as arbitrary, they should be accepting the ruling of the UN, an independent group of people who are saying this is arbitrary. Mm-hmm. And therefore, that should lend to collective response because a state can say, hey, like-minded partners, those who've signed the Canadian Declaration, can you call this state out? Because the UN is saying it's an arbitrary detention. So that is a rule that should be used more and is not. Another is, I think taking that statement, you can use it in another context, and that's with protecting the hostage themselves, but also in getting a better response at that level. So in many arbitrary detention cases, the hostage has not got consular visits. Mm. That is unacceptable. Mm-hmm. The hostage must, especially where the UN has declared this an arbitrary detention, there has to be access to the hostage because something is not right about that detention. Mm-hmm. And that hostage has to be protected. That hostage also has to be informed because if they are not, the detaining state controls the narrative with the hostage. Mm-hmm. And they tell them, your government's doing nothing, nobody cares, sign this paper, make a confession, cooperate with us. The hostages
which we know happens
vulnerable.
In almost all the cases.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. They are vulnerable to that. And if they do that, that also hampers the response of their home country. Mm-hmm. So it's not in the interests of anyone, least of all the hostage, but also the state negotiating the release, for there not to be consular access. Now, the Vienna Conventions on Consular Relations give every state that right to have consular access and to seek legal representation for their national. And the UN determination on arbitrary detention can be used as a tool to get other states to call out the detaining state for not allowing the national state to have that access. And it should be done.
Jason,
I just wanted to add something. Yeah, I think those arbitrary detention designations by the United Nations are really important and underutilized, but it also goes to show the serial trend that is happening in a lot of these countries. You can see from CMAC's case, Nazar's case, my case, the same people involved over and over again, and it creates a body of evidence to work with. I also wanted to just throw out an idea for the signers of the Declaration. Maybe a guarantee of consular access to anybody who is imprisoned in one of the signing countries to all the other signers is a very easy and first step to make as a commitment around this issue. Because I think that consular access is something that is so critical in these cases that, you know, many of us have been denied. And to see other countries sign on to this. Last thing I wanted to say on this is that at the event at the UN back in September, I was approached by a foreign minister of one of the signing countries who said to me, you know, I deal with this on a regular basis with a neighboring country of mine, and I never thought about it in this framework. This is a country that's actually signed on to this declaration.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an education aspect with like-minded countries who maybe think that this is a problem that bigger, more powerful countries deal with, and they don't. But once you kind of break it down, I think this is something that is pretty incredibly widespread.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Jason. And Louise, given that those tools are available but are underutilized, and your experience at the UN, why do you think they are underutilized? I mean, is it an awareness problem? Is it just an sort of unwillingness to take that step?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to it. I would be speculating. I think, we get set in our ways and the way we conduct diplomacy and what our priorities are. I mean, I find it very interesting that it's the families that we tend to direct to the UN to get that designation when the state could do it. I've not worked on the direct case personally doing that, so I don't know what goes on into our into the thinking of underutilization. But I mean, that is one area that it's underutilized. I mean, I don't think that, but there's, and then you've got the area that is ineffective.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about the UN Security Council. I mean, there's been resolutions that have condemned specific cases that have gone completely unanswered or unresolved. And then there's the things the new things that we could be doing that we're not doing. And I think you have to look at that full grouping. And at the UN, we have groups of friends on just about anything and everything. And I don't know whether now there is a group of friends on this. Is there? No. But this is just the way diplomacy is conducted. It's very interesting business because these little groups of friends, it's the ambassadors meeting informally, getting together, exchanging practice. It's a dialogue. We complain at the UN that there's too many of these. Well, there's the group of friends of water, group of friends of happiness, group of friends of, but we Canada started the group of friends of innovative financing when I was there, which was extremely effective at moving forward, at building momentum, at keeping that issue at the top of mind. Because if it's not going to be on the agenda of the UN through a special session or through a resolution that goes through 6th committee every year, at least you can have this grouping of ambassadors that meet on it, and we can have the special envoy come and brief. Just keep that, UNGA is great, but it's once a year.
Right.
The rest of the time, there's a lot of work that could be done to just advance the conversation.
And that goes back to Jason's point about just education and
That's
raising
right.
awareness.
And it's exactly right. And it just once is not enough. It has to be ongoing. People circulate in and out of the UN, and you never know. You gather your allies over time. And I think there's still those tools that are out there. And Joly, and we can talk about it. You're in touch with with our embassy there. Couldn't have a better person heading this for Canada. Really proud of our representation. But yeah, that's how we look. I just would just really be like a fly, and just that they need to swat. Just really be in their face and continue to be so. And I think and do that education piece. Bring people that we might not have thought would have been allies that are really seeing their interests being made through it.
So you mentioned something, Louise, that I'm going to go back and ask you about, Jason, which is sometimes it's not a priority for states. And this is part of the discussion. Like, when does it become a priority, and how do you make it a priority?
Well, I mean, it becomes a priority most often when it becomes politically expensive for it not to be a priority. So there is a certain amount of an adversarial relationship I think that a family, an employer, someone who is having to deal with, has to take publicly with a state that they are trying to compel to bring a person home. I mean, I understood very well that the Islamic Republic of Iran was holding me, but it was going to be the President of the United States, whoever that person happened to be, that was going to make a decision that brought me home. I think my friends here who've been in a similar situation know that feeling as well. So it's a delicate balance that needs to be maintained. But I think, Roger and his team are incredibly adept at holding those two conflicting understandings that a family is going to do whatever it needs to. And I've talked to him, personally on several cases where he said, families are going to do what they need to do. It's not going to change how I do my job. And I think that his predecessors in this position hold that same attitude. But I've watched as my news organization, advocated for me, the Wall Street Journal for Evan Gershkovich, the NBA and WNBA for Brittany Griner. All of this stuff makes a massive difference. But I think that we're getting to a point where the friends and allies of the issue here in the United States are becoming many. In the last decade, we've had at least 20 states where constituents have been taken hostage by foreign governments. So the number of members of Congress and senators who've had to deal with this issue, who've had to come face to face with families, is large. When I came home 8 years ago, there was probably 8 or 9 members of Congress who had dealt with it. Now we're talking about dozens of people. And so in our work at CSIS, we try and really call this out as a nonpartisan issue, maybe the last nonpartisan issue. And keeping it in that realm is super important. But ultimately, people don't come home until there's a political cost to them not coming home.
Laura, do you want to comment on this from the perspective of families? This is the most important priority for them. And how do you have that conversation when the state may talk about it but may not act on it as a priority?
Yeah, I mean, for families, they need to get in front of their governments, and that's, again, it's having the right person who they feel is actually prioritizing this. For many states who don't have a figure such as SPIHA or SOHA, in Canada as there will now be, they feel that by dealing with the civil servants day to day who are coming and going, who don't have the institutional knowledge behind this, they feel extremely frustrated. There's often lack of handover between government personnel who are dealing with the matter. And I've been in meetings with families where they've said, but you've just contradicted what your colleague told me at the last meeting. And that takes away any reassurance that the government is prioritizing this and doing their best to bring the loved one home. So it's really important for families to know that that there's someone accountable at a senior level who is taking the lead, and that's why we get so many requests in countries where there isn't a SPIHA for can we see the foreign minister, can we see the prime minister? They want to have that face-to-face meeting with the person they think can call the shots, and until they do, they are not satisfied. So I think following the lead of what the United States has done with SPIHA, I think is a good idea, because it will help families feel that this is being given the attention that it deserves. I think that's a starting point. Getting collective action behind that, yes. I mean, I've been in meetings where families have said to the government personnel, so you don't have the answer to that question, but have you asked your allies? Have you asked your other governments who maybe have had this experience that you haven't had? And you see them grabbing their pens and scribbling that, we'll take that away. So I think, why haven't they done that?
Yeah.
That should have been happening at the outset, because at the end of the day, every government has partners that they can ask that information for. A lot of the time it's not classified information at all. It's simply information that might be out there in the public, but it's also about best practice and what works. So I think it's having a better response, collective action, partnerships with other states and other sectors of society, as well as having the right people and the role in government would be the place to start.
And I mean, we talked about this already, you know, the role of the United Nations, the role of other multilateral organizations, the role of civil society, but specifically in addressing this as a security threat. And, you know, Jason, you talked about elevating the cost. What role do all these players play in not just furthering the discussions, but in strengthening the mechanisms that are available? Like, what does it take?
I think we're still figuring out what it's going to take, right? And I feel like we're a lot closer to it today than we were 4 or 5 years ago, but we're still a long way away. When President Biden declared the national emergency a year and a half ago, I felt as though, okay, this is an issue that has caught the attention. It's no longer seen as one-off cases, right, done by bad actors. This is part of a trend, and not a trend just in one country, and a trend in several countries, and a series of countries that's expanding. And so there is this recognition and this acknowledgement that this is spiraling out of our control. And, you know, when we put numbers on it, at the time I was arrested, you know, I think there were probably 3 or 4 people arbitrarily detained or wrongfully detained. It wasn't a specific designation for that at the time.
Yeah.
There were many more people who were being held hostage by terrorists or criminal organizations. The numbers have flip-flopped, you know, to foreign states being the main perpetrator in these cases. 60-something people, I think Secretary said, still on the list. What if that number grows to 600 people? You know, is the State Department going to be able to deploy resources to handle that? And if the U.S. government decides, under whatever administration happens to be in power, that they aren't going to deploy those kinds of resources, what does it mean to our ability to travel the world? What does it mean to our abilities to do business in other countries? What does it mean for the essence of what it means to be a citizen of this country and any other country that is a democracy? And I think that's how we have to be thinking about this in the very short term, medium term, and long term, because it's a threat to the very idea of being a citizen of a democratic country.
And Louise, I know you have to leave us, but I want to give you the floor for any final remarks you want to add on all the excellent points you already made.
Oh, thank you, Marissa. I don't want to take any more time. I think all the important things have been said, and I hope that this was helpful for those who deal with this every day, that have to find the solutions. I think I want to just congratulate everyone that's been involved, Chris for being such a great partner with Canada through the years, the Wilson Center. It's been my honor to be here and share a little bit of my experience and have such a great panelist to do it with. So I will grab my bag and go, and I hate to do that, but I do have to catch that flight. So
thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we do have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, and I have one here from our online audience, Erin from the Institute of World Politics. How can governments be more proactive and dry up the supply of potential hostages? It appears that the U.S. State Department travel warnings aren't being read or heeded.
I mean,
first,
I don't think that I've talked to people in government over the last several years about the idea of putting travel bans on specific countries. I don't think that anybody has decided that is a particularly useful idea or practical one. In a country like Iran, at any given time, there are tens of thousands. I think the last count was about 13,000 U.S. citizens, dual nationals, who've registered as residing in Iran. So that's the number of people that have held their hand up and said that we're here.
Yeah.
You assume that the number is double, triple that. So, drying up the number of possible hostages in these countries is a harder task, I think, than doing the hard work of figuring out how to make it less interesting to the perpetrators who are doing it.
Lara?
I think on the subject of travel bans, I mean, a lot of the cases that we're supporting are in arbitrary detention, are dual nationals, and any travel ban will be harmful to them, the people who are most at risk. So they have family. A lot of these people are taken when they've gone to say goodbye to loved ones who are on their death's bed, and to deprive them of that is almost as bad as exposing them to arbitrary detention. So it's not the solution, a travel ban. I think what could be better is actually borrowing some tips maybe from the private sector about what information should be given to travellers. When employees are sent out by a company to a high-risk state, there is a risk assessment done. Their routines are looked at, where they're going to be staying, what they're going to be doing, the type of work they're going to be doing. And that plays into how they can mitigate the risk of being either kidnapped or detained arbitrarily. So I think there are other ways to be creative, again, going back to we have to be creative in terms of deterrence as well as response. There are other things that can be done, that governments can be proactive in changing the travel advice in a way that is more helpful and is not punishing those most at risk.
And thank you for highlighting once again the important role that the private sector plays, not only with economic leverage, but also just as you mentioned, the tips and that conversation that you have with the private sector. One more question. This is to you, Jason, but I'm sure, Lara, you can also maybe add to that. So what are some examples of acceptable concessions that you had referred to?
I mean, I think that the truth is, as far as I'm concerned, bringing fellow citizens home as quickly and safely as possible is going to require all sorts of flexibility in concession making. In some of the cases that we've seen, it's been one-on-one trades. There's been sanctions lifted. There's been money changing hands. There's been presidential tweets. I mean, there's been all sorts of stuff that's happened. I don't want to put a number on it. To me, it's bring these people home as quickly, as safely as possible, and at the same time, put in the resources, energy, and time to figure out how to make it costlier and how to punish on the back end of these cases, which I believe that process is ongoing, but we need an action plan. We need tools to use, and we need it pretty soon. And some of these countries that do this need to feel the hurt in a very public way. One of the things that didn't come up on the last panel about the tools, I think it needs to be made public and clear. This is the cost of doing this particular activity.
So shaming, but then we've also heard Professor talk about living in a shameless or increasingly shameless culture.
Not just shame, expense.
Expense, yeah, making it hurt, like you said. Lara, anything you want to add here from a perspective of, working with the families and the victims?
Yeah, obviously, going back to what the first panel said, and Rachel mentioned this, that, the families will pay anything to get their loved ones home and do anything. So what concessions are acceptable? Any. In their view. I mean, that, ultimately, that is how the families will approach this. And that's also why they're looking at every option open to them. They're looking at, shall I go to the media and make this a really public case? Shall I go on a hunger strike? They will, and we've seen them do it, they will do anything. So I think states have to take into account that is the family position. And I think probably just to wind up on the whole issue of this being a security threat and what what that might look like for fortifying shared security. I would look at the example of kidnap for ransom, where you have, and this is my experience from the private sector speaking here, where you have cases where the states are leading and where private sector are leading. And what does collective action, what does collective response look like? We have a situation where in kidnapping, which anybody can be kidnapped, and many are, sometimes they're taken individually, but when they're taken in groups of multinationals, and the state is leading on the response, have we ever seen collective action, collective response? No. Every state has their own policy that they implement, concessions or otherwise, and their own approach. And what's the result been? The result has been that some of those hostages have come home based on their nationality, and some have not.
Yeah.
And for families sitting and waiting for the loved one to go home, those who don't, absolute devastation.
Of course.
And anger, real anger. So what does the private sector tell us about this? Well, when I was in the private sector, I saw cases of multiple victims being taken, multiple hostages, different nationalities, and crucially, different organizations that they were working for. And the private sector response, well, first of all, the kidnappers would say, we're going to divide you up into groups. So they wanted to negotiate separately with each organization. Private sector response is, don't let them do that. We have to act together. This group of people, whatever their nationality, whoever they were working for, they have got to come out together. And the family member would say, oh, but what if there's an opportunity to get my loved one out first?
Yeah.
I don't want to lose that. And the response from the advisors was, what if another family member said that, and that left your loved one behind, and then you were stuck? And they said, oh no, that's right, we need to do this together. And so what they did was bring all the organizations who had employees caught up in the same situation and got them to agree on a joint strategy, collective response to a security threat, joint strategy to get them out. And guess what? They got them all out together. So I think that is maybe a takeaway, that we can learn from other sectors on how to respond to this crime, either kidnapping or arbitrary detention. I see them as as something you can compare, and I think that's possibly what we can learn from that.
Thank you for that. So we're I guess nearing the end. We want to make sure that there's enough time for networking. That's and sharing more contacts and information. But thank you so much to both of you for sharing your expertise and your lived experience as well. Just a few points just to sort of remind us of some of the takeaways from today. We've heard this from Foreign Minister Joly as well as Secretary of State Tony Blinken, that the practice of arbitrary detention, which is very often used for diplomatic leverage, is an important international security concern. And as what we've witnessed and heard from Jason and others, I'm very lucky to be mentored on a daily basis almost by Hale as the founder of the Middle East program, and heard her story, that this presents a very serious challenge to the international security system, as well as the international-based order that offers different norms to deal with, but unfortunately, it's not always respected by the various actors. And the key is to engage many stakeholders, from the families to the private sector, to the various bodies that are already in place, such as the United Nations, as well as civil society and international NGOs. Of course, there's a lot more to do on this. The conversation is continuing, and we look forward to more discussions. But going back to some of the earlier remarks from the previous panel, it's about investing in data, in research, to make sure that we have a lot more information sharing of best practices and lessons learned is key to further strengthening all the different tools and ensuring that we have more tools at our disposal in the future. And as going back to your point, Jason, to make it very costly for this to happen and so strengthen deterrence. So thank you for all of you for being here in person and for our online audience. Thanks to CSIS, to Canada Global, and the State Department for all the work, and thanks to my dear colleague Chris Sands for his leadership on this very important issue at the Wilson Center. Thank you.